Where's my microphone? Hello.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you all for being here for this program with Debbie Millman. So I think everyone knows who you are. So by way of introduction, I'll say a couple things. One is, so I've been really, really looking forward to meeting you and talking with you. And then I learned this week, I think, that it was your birthday on Tuesday.
Oh, yeah, last week, yeah.
Oh,
Okay. It was October 29th. It's wrong online somewhere, and people think it's November 2nd, but I don't know why.
Funny, okay. Well, my birthday's November 1st, so I was like, this is
happy
so
birthday,
serendipitous.
Scorpio's sister.
Yeah, Scorpio's sister. And in Chicago, you know, we celebrate birthdays for weeks, so I like to think of this as just part of your birthday celebration.
Absolutely.
So thank
you for both of us.
Yeah, thank you for spending it with us. Thank you for this amazing book. You know, there's something about your biography that I find so interesting, which is every time, like if you look at the history of why design matters, how it all began. So you were approached by Voice America to do this limited series on branding, and you kind of said, okay, but let it be about design. You know, we'll get to branding as part of that, but I want to talk to designers about design.
Right.
And then when it moved from being a radio show to a podcast, eventually you expanded the platform even more to think about creatives writ large and how to design a life and live creatively and all the kinds of obstacles and opportunities in that. Like it's as if, and now we have this gorgeous book, but there's something about you that I want to talk about, but I find so appealing and interesting that you always have this vision of the bigger picture, right? Like you're given an opportunity, but you see it in like this much bigger way.
Well, I don't know if I would necessarily agree with that, but thank you for thinking it and for saying it. For me, a lot of it has been, whenever I've been given the opportunity to do something, I always assumed it would be the only opportunity I ever got. And so therefore I had to say yes to everything. And then once I said yes, to try to, in some ways, ever so slightly, make it my own. And so that's really how the radio show turned into the podcast. I didn't think I would ever get another opportunity. That's even how my first book happened. I hated the title that the publisher suggested that I write this book about, but I thought, you know, I'm never ever going to have another opportunity to do this, so I better do it the way they want me to do it, and then try to sort of Trojan horse a different way in.
Yeah, and now you've written 7 books, so yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to start with the book As Object, because it's an incredibly beautiful book, and I read this great quote from you in which you said, and I think this in part has to do with why you're so successful in the world of branding. You said, I am endlessly fascinated by the choices people make for the objects in their lives, what they choose to surround themselves with, the kinds of things they buy and share and eat and wear. So let's talk about this book and why it looks like this. I mean, it's a coffee table book. It's like super heavy. It's
5 pounds.
So I can work out with it in addition to reading it. But it's, you know, it's also a deep and substantive book, but it's beautiful. I mean, there's these full page photographs of all kinds of different people. There's really nice kinds of design choices made. So can you just talk a little bit about how you thought about the book as an object before we dive into the content?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you. This was the first book that I was publishing with a major publisher. And so this was the first time there was a little bit of a budget to actually do anything. And I was, when I was offered the book deal, they presented it to me as if I would be able to write it and design it and make all those choices myself. And so to be honest, I will say I put my entire advance into the production because I wanted to have a great designer work with me. I wanted to have really beautiful photography. The original intention pre-COVID was that I was going to go on a photo shoot around the country and shoot everybody that I was going to include in the book. And that didn't quite work out. And so what I ended up having to do, which turned out to be a real joy for me, and one of the favorite parts of doing this book, was then doing my research to find beautiful photography that would be able to work in a book that would still have a connective thread. And so I have some of the best photographers in the world having contributed photos that they already took of these amazing people. So on the one hand, the photography is probably a lot better than I could have been able to get on my own, but it also ended up costing a lot more because I needed to buy the rights of these great, great photographs. And so what I ended up doing was looking for photographers that had taken great pictures, but then looking at some of the other photos they took in that photo shoot so they wouldn't be repeated. So they weren't maybe the one that people saw, you know, in Rolling Stone, but
Oh, that's
there
smart.
were, you know, in that same day, so they were different. So the connective thread that I sort of forced myself to fit into was that you had to see the soul of the person in every photograph. So while it might be completely different photographers, and in many cases, I think there may be 2 or 3 photographers that have more than one photo in the book, but the soul of the person is in their eyes, and you can kind of put them together in that way.
Everyone has a photograph, I think, except for Chris Ware. I'm going to try and lift this up. Chicagoan Chris Ware, who has like a very perfectly has a drawing. His drawing.
Yeah, he did an original drawing for the book, and rather than send in a photo, because I asked all of the people, do you have a photographer that you've worked with that's taken a photo of you that you really love that I can be in contact with? And so a lot of people had that, but Chris sent back his self-portrait.
That is very Chris Ware.
It's very Chris Ware.
So I want to talk about, and one more question. Why the oversized coffee table? What was that? What were you thinking about with that?
So I feel so embarrassed telling you this, because nobody's asked me that. So one of my design heroes is Michael Beirut.
Who's in the book.
Who's in the book. He's a designer. He's a partner at Pentagram, and he's designed some of the most beautiful brands and logos for institutions in the world. He's really one of my favorite people. And he published a book, and there's actually another funny story that comes after this, which isn't really that funny, but it's a good story. So he published a book, his own monograph, about 5 or 6 years ago, and it's called How To, and it's really about how he created all of this magnificent work for so many different clients over his long and illustrious career. And it's the same size, and it's the same publisher. So when I got the book deal, I was like, and because there was going to be so many years apart, I said, you know, I'd really love the same specs as, because they needed to spec out the book to understand how much they were going to charge for it and so forth. And I'd really like the same specs as Michael. So I kind of copied him. So I didn't think anybody would know or realize or even care. Then it came time to do the book cover. And I hired one of the greatest book designers in the world to do this book for me, Paul Sayre. And we both had a very typographic book cover in mind, and were completely simpatico about what we thought we wanted this to look like. We did this one cover, we both loved it, sent it to the publisher, and they're like, well, we think there's going to be a problem with this cover. And I'm like, what? And they're like, it looks too much like Michael Beirut's cover. And I'm like, but that book was published 6 years ago. And they're like, oh no, we're coming out with another copy of a revised version of it the same month as your book is coming out. And now because it's the same specs, it's going to look too similar. People won't know them.
Busted.
Won't be able to take them, be able to keep them apart.
Yeah.
And so then we ended up having, because Paul and I were so sort of fixated on this cover that we both loved. I think sometimes when you hire a designer to do, and having had been in this position myself, when you put your sort of best idea out there and it gets killed right away, you're kind of deflated for the rest of the experience. And so Paul and I collaborated, and we did like 90 other covers.
Wow.
And finally, in frustration, he was like, okay, I can't do anymore, I quit. So I had to hire another designer to do the whole book, kind of at the last minute. But I didn't blame Paul one bit, because, I would have done the same thing in his position.
Right, he had a vision, but
Yeah.
it couldn't be. So then, is that where the kind of, the line
scribble?
drawing, the hand, I know you,
So
by
I
hand
did that
text is one of
scribble.
your signatures.
Yes,
yeah.
it is. But so I didn't know what to do at that point. I was literally crying. But on the one hand, I was absolutely sure that Paul made the right decision and was glad that he felt strong enough about our relationship to know that he could do that and we'd still be friends. I think he did it so we would still be friends. But at that point, I also was like, I can't go to any of my other friends because they're going to think they're sloppy seconds. So what do I do? And so my agent put me in touch with the son of Myra Kelman. Myra's also featured in the book. Charlotte Sheedy is my agent, and she also represents Myra. And Alex, her son, was now fully grown and was a designer in his own right and had recently collaborated with Myra on some of her books, also published by HarperCollins. So he had a good relationship with the people at HarperCollins, and so then I hired Alex. And Alex did a bunch of covers that he was also, those first covers, you're like, I really love this. And I'm like, I really don't. And he was like, but I really love it. And I'm like, but I really don't. And then the first cover he did was the one that he loved. And then he did a couple of revisions on that theme. And one was featuring a giant question mark with a scribble where the dot of the question mark goes. I'm like, I don't really love this, but I love that. And he's like, really? And I'm like, yes, I think it would be great. There's something wonderful about a closed scribble. Conversations can go anywhere. It's an infinite scribble, so there's no beginning or end. And it just felt thematically like it was the right thing to do. And so finally, after a total of 120 covers, we got the cover.
Wow. Well, it works really well. It's a really nice thematic throughout. The other dimension that I was curious about, so when people talk about a Why Design Matters interview, the quintessential Why Design Matters interview is biographical, the who, what, where, when, how of the person. And so to start, I was curious, why are you so interested in the biography of the people that you interview?
I had a really rough time becoming an adult. I grew up in a really turbulent way. There was a lot of trauma, a lot of real hard experiences. And it took me well into my 40s to feel like I kind of sort of knew who I was, and really not until my early 50s that I felt comfortable being who I was. And I've been really, again, endlessly fascinated, really obsessively curious with how really creative people become who they are. How do they have that courage to seek what they want right out of the gate, to declare that they want to be artists, to feel confident in who they are, to offer whatever it is they're making to the world? That takes an enormous amount of confidence, courage, sort of a sense of who you are, and that to me feels like the Holy Grail. Like finding that answer in anyone is finding their sort of spark for life. And that is something that I just find to be utterly compelling.
It's also, to me, I wondered, because you're interested in what people do and how they came to do it, but biography is such a slippery thing because we're constantly, like you're saying, I mean, when do we find out who we are? And at any given moment, how we view our life story shifts, right? So it's sort of this, it's constantly shifting. And so I wondered if in some way it's also a way in for you to how your subjects think.
Very much.
Yeah.
The idea of making something from nothing, which is the common denominator through this book. Every person in this book is creating something from nothing. It could be a piece of music, it could be a book, it could be a play, it could be a poem. They're making something where it didn't exist before. And the act of making something like that is miraculous. It's truly miraculous. And understanding that, especially when I wanted to make so many things but didn't know the way in, how to find a path, how to forge the path once I sort of got through the door, to me, I feel like that's something everyone is interested in. just by the sheer virtue of being human.
Yeah.
How do creative people make creative things? And so that, though the biography can change, and the sort of idea of memory, and every time we have a memory, we're remaking the memory, there's still a way of understanding one's origin story that's interesting, whether they're reimagining it or whether it's, accurately as presented. I still think there's something really interesting about the idea of memory itself.
Yeah, yeah, that's beautiful. There's also, when you were talking about your own life story, to me, there's a through line, not in every interview, but in this book, in the choices you make, because there's 50-something interviews here, and you've interviewed hundreds of people, hundreds and hundreds, is that it's almost like a guide to survival, a survival guide. It's about how to survive rejection, failure, trauma, emotional, physical, sexual abuse. It's survive and then thrive in a way. I mean, these are people who seem like they really are thriving.
Well, that's another piece of the act of being human that I find so riveting, that everyone has their trauma, whether they share it publicly or not. And there's no one that's included in this book that wasn't comfortable with sharing their story in this particular method. The fact that they're willing to share that becomes a blueprint for other people to see that, oh, this is survivable, or I can use this as a way into making something else. And that I also think gives people hope. The one common denominator, people are always asking me, what is the one common denominator that these people share? And it's not just these people, it's anybody that I've interviewed, and that is they've struggled. They have struggled to become who they are in some way. No one is able to outrun that. And to see the various ways in which people have responded to their own struggles, I think gives everybody hope. Everybody that's struggling, hope. Everybody that's trying to make something and isn't sure how, a sense of, I can do that too then.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, really important.
It makes me think of, I think there's so many great nuggets in the book, like just nuggets of wisdom that, you can, I'm sure you've got your list of things that have come to you through these interviews, but like Marina Abramovic says, suffering is a teacher. She's one of those people that had a really tough life. On the other hand, you have David Byrne, who says, look, if you're going to learn something new, you should be constantly rewarding yourself along the way. That's the way to learn, to build in that reward system. Or I think one of my favorite interviews in the book is with Linda Barry, who's just incredible. And she has that vision of like putting children together with graduate students, because some of the things that we really struggle with are things that we didn't as children necessarily. And there's this great moment where Linda Barry, when you're drawing hands is really hard, and she asks this to the kids, or she says that to the kids, and they say, no, it's not, it's a snowball and 5 thumbs, which is like, it could be the title of a book, A Snowball and 5 Thumbs, How to Draw a Hand. But
I do have to say, I think my Linda Barry interview is maybe my best ever, because of Linda, not because of me. You're only as good as who you're interviewing in this manner, and I have to say, she was and is... now she's gotten the MacArthur Genius Award, so it was like, yay.
Yeah.
But she's amazing. The amount of wisdom she shares.
Every line in the interview is something that you'll pause and think about. She's incredible. But do you have were there insights like that for you across these interviews that really, I assume you love them all, but that really resonated with you?
It was really hard to choose who to include. And so I had to give myself some criteria so that I felt like, how do you go through nearly 500 interviews, every single one you've invited that person to be interviewed, how do you pick from that? And ultimately, over the years, my interviews went from being sort of 60-minute interviews that my producer would cut down to 35, 45 minutes to 2-hour interviews that my producer would edit down to an hour to hour and 15. So when you transcribe them, which is what I had to do, they ultimately, those hour and 15, it's 10,000 words.
Yeah.
My original book contract was for a 70,000 word book. Well, there's no way that they're going to choose 7 interviews to represent a body of work that's been 17 years long. And so I had to figure out a way that I could sort of excerpt as much as possible from an interview to have it a standalone piece that would feel compelling from beginning to end without including everything that I included in the original interview, which is sort of somebody's entire life.
Yeah.
So I had to be able to excerpt enough that would feel like a nugget that was really still vibrant and had some groundedness to it. I also wanted it to be a bit more timeless, so it couldn't be about except for the interview about Hamilton with Tommy Kail, which I think just stands on its own because of what he talks about in the creation of Hamilton. Almost everything else is relatively timeless and isn't about one specific piece of work, but a body of work. And then the other part was I needed a beautiful photograph.
Right. So,
And so there were times where the journey to getting a beautiful photograph that was filled with Elizabeth Alexander's soul became my holy grail by the end of the book, because she's so brilliant and she's so unconcerned about the photography that she's been part of. And so I got the sort of professional photograph that's on the Mellon Foundation website. I'm like, no, I really want something that has a little bit more of you in it, you the poet, not you the foundation president.
yeah.
And she was like, this is a good photograph. You know? And so I ended up having to text a mutual friend of ours to text her to please take it seriously so that I could get something that reflected her energy and her sort of dynamism and everything about her. And finally, at the last minute, I got something. And I think it's one of the best in the book.
It's a great photo. It is. In terms of the structure, so in making those choices, you have it organized there. The legends, truth tellers, culture makers, trendsetters, and you end with visionaries. But there are also ways in which things kind of roll from one to the next. Like I was thinking about, you have an interview with the wonderful writer Carmen Maria Machado, and she ends with this, she's talking about what she calls like the boorish sexism of the 2016 election, and that, you know, we're in this crisis of gender, and her closing thought is that we've always had this really messed up way of talking about women and talking about women's bodies, and she says, and I don't think that's going to change. I'm a pessimist about that. And then the very next page is one of these, it's not a full interview, but it's a quote from Shirley Manson, or the singer, the performer, and she starts, I think it's something like, I am definitely an aggressive woman, and I own that, and I'm proud of being that, and I'm who I am because I'm an aggressive woman. And I love that kind of like juxtaposition. So how much were you thinking about, not just one by one, the interviews you wanted in here, but how you could put them together to offer those kinds of, like that scribble thing, right? All those different points of view.
I think a lot of that was Alex Kelman, my designer. Because he did,
wow.
I gave him the order of the interviews. But then we also had about 60 of these quotes that I wanted to include. And he asked if he could work on the juxtaposition. And I think that's a lot of what he brought to the book.
Oh, very cool. Yeah,
Yeah.
It's an interesting kind of narrative. When you're interviewing people, so you talked earlier about your life, and that it was a challenging life. You know, you had a really rough childhood. I think you've said elsewhere, like for 18 years, you lived in a state of terror. But as an interviewer, often interviewers are kind of opaque, or they remove themselves to let who they're interviewing come forth. How comfortable do you feel talking about your personal life or personal things in the context of an interview?
Not very. I'll sometimes say more during the actual interview that my producer cuts out because he's very strict about sort of how much me is in these interviews. But sometimes it's hard not to say, oh my God, I had the same thing happen to me, and then we chat about that, and Curtis pulls that out. And the final interview doesn't have it in there. I really try to focus all of my energy on listening and not talking so much. And when I am talking, it's still furthering the conversation that my guest is going to have. So it makes it really easy for them to feel seen and heard and respected and acknowledged as this is their moment to be fully who they are.
Yeah.
So I try not to very much. However, because of an interview I did with Tim Ferriss 5 or so years ago, where he asked me about my life in a way that no other interviewer ever had, and I sort of disclosed more about my childhood, more about the sexual abuse that I had experienced, that's something sometimes the guests want to talk to me about because of their experience, so they feel a little bit more safe in sharing. And so then I will offer and will share. But unless they specifically sort of go there, I won't on my own.
Yeah. Or there are moments where I think in the interview with Anne Lamott, she's talking about who's someone, I didn't know that until I read the interview you'd done with her, that struggled with addiction and all kinds of things. And she talks about deciding to slow life down. And your response to that is, oh, that it scares you because you're always running, you're always on the run, and you don't want to lose that. What is the that? So you react to something she said, and something about you that's personal comes out, but what is the that you don't want to lose, and what is the running?
The addiction to feeling productive. The addiction to feeling like I'm doing something that matters and not just okay to be as is, which is something I began to feel during the pandemic because I was forced to slow down. I was forced to stop being as busy. And for the first time in my life, felt okay about that. Like, I can feel okay just gardening. I can feel okay just reading. I don't have to be productive every single minute of my life in order for my life to be meaningful and to matter. And then the world started to come back, and I was just having this conversation with one of my dearest friends who's here, and one of my former superstar students who is also here, and talking about what that meant. And we were just about to continue the conversation when we had to come on stage, and even Christine was like, oh, I don't know if you'll ever be able to get back to that, because I'm back on that, it's a very addictive, dopamine-producing feeling of, I'm doing something that's worth it, so therefore I'm worth it. And it felt good to not be in that addictive way, because that's why when Anne was talking about her addiction and then getting into this space. And what's interesting, I was talking to someone recently who talked about addiction jumping. So you might be addicted to one thing, and then when you give up that thing, that substance, you might become addicted to something else because the addiction will jump.
Yeah.
And I definitely feel like for me, getting past that addiction will be life-freeing, because it would be just really wonderful to feel at ease with oneself without any external affirmation that comes from, not having that center that's really strong and solid.
Yeah, and that is another through line of the book. It's not everyone, but there's so many people in this who in the way you're saying, in the face of, and I think Tim Ferriss is one of them who you invoked, in the face of really horrible, challenging conditions of growing up, or became these ultra superhuman, hyper productive kinds of people. I mean, how do you think about that in terms of creativity? Because you're celebrating creativity, you're celebrating all these things about what is it that we do that really makes us fully human, but at the same time acknowledging or unsurfacing the way in which so much of that creativity comes from a trying to kind of mask or make oneself feel better or prove to the world you are not what happened to you, kind of thing.
I think I was asked this question in an interview. No, I heard this question being asked in an interview. Jocelyn Glei has a wonderful podcast called Hurry Slowly. And she asks the question to her audience, who are you without the doing, without the making? And that's terrifying for people, especially people that do have that artistic outlet and can maybe take what might have been a more dysfunctional or destructive addiction and put it into the making of things, in order to feel better about who they are. Well, who are you when you're not doing that?
Yeah.
And it can be terrifying. For me, it's been a lifelong pursuit to figure that out. I don't have any answers.
I was going to say, I'm not going to put you on
I
the
wish
spot.
I did.
I'm not going to put you on the spot.
No, I mean, I think it's a very scary place to feel like well, for some people that have been through a lot of trauma, to feel like you don't matter, so therefore we're going to just do whatever we want to you because you don't matter, to then come out of that and feel like, okay, well, now I'm going to try to knit my being okay, being me back together. And that takes a really long time to do, especially if those things that happened to you when you were sort of just forming. And then how do you reform when you've already been formed and have been informed in this way?
Yeah.
And that's, I think, a lifelong process. For me, it's been a lifelong process.
There's in the book, Eileen Miles talks about how, remember, she ran for president. Right? she likens a campaign to like improvisational performance art, and she thought, oh yeah, I could do this, it will just extend my art practice, right? Which I thought was pretty hilarious. I mean, do you, in terms of thinking about productivity, is there anything that design can't do for you, or is everything that you think about that you might want to do, or who you are as an artist, something that design can help extend for you?
Well, design is really about intention. It's about approaching everything with intention. You're designing every day of your life with the things you decide to do and be part of and eat and drink and wear and so forth. And so that deliberate differentiation becomes an act of design, which is different from branding, which is also something I'm really interested in, because branding is essentially manufactured. We're manufacturing meaning through the design of this thing. But the act of design is very intentional. Mm-hmm. And so I do think that you can approach everything that way if you want to. Sometimes it's subconscious. I mean, most times it's subconscious. I remember years and years ago, when my dad was alive, he decided he was no longer comfortable wearing the logos of Lacoste and Ralph Lauren on his polo shirts. Like, I'm no longer going to be a billboard for these commercial enterprises. Like, okay, Dad, that's cool. So he decided, rather than just buy new ones without any logo on it, he didn't want to waste his money, he was going to put a flag pin over the logos. Like, Dad, that is also a symbol of something that has meaning and a whole slew of attributes that you are now expressing to others with the choice of wearing your flag pin. He didn't quite see it the same way, but we agreed to disagree.
Right. I have a couple questions related to that. One is that, so among the legends that start the book is Milton Glaser. And I mean, the book just starts with some really big questions, like what is art? What makes art different from work? All these different things, big, like humanities questions. But Milton Glaser is really interesting in that and thinking about how do you separate out those things, and how do you commit to, have a sort of principled practice, right? And where you have a set of higher, what are you not going to do, and then what are you aiming towards, so you can kind of stay on track. And you talked, and maybe it was in that interview with Tim Ferriss, that taking a course with Milton Glaser was like the defining moment of your life. So why? What happened? And what have you learned from him? May he rest in peace.
Yes. Well, for anybody that might not be aware, Milton Glaser created the I Heart New York logo. He also created a very famous poster of a profile of Bob Dylan with Bob Dylan's hair and this sort of very colorful, not quite a rainbow, but very colorful sort of hair strands. And that's really become one of his most famous pieces as well. And quite by accident, I found out through getting an early copy of print magazine because I was writing a column for them. One year you get the author's issues first. They come right off the printer and sent to the writers. And I got a copy, and in that was an ad for a summer intensive that Milton Glaser was teaching at the School of Visual Arts. This was long before I taught, well, not that long, but about 2 years before I started teaching at SVA. And it was really positioned to mid-career professional designers that might be looking to reinvigorate or recharge their careers. And I was really looking for that back then. I was going through a very intense creative slump. I felt that my creativity had been utterly diluted by dedicating my career to branding and corporate design, and that everything I was doing at that time was about a shareholder investment and shelf position and shareholder value, and it just felt like everything I was doing had sort of just pulled every bit of creativity that was pure and honest and non-commercial out. And here I saw this ad, and because I was getting the magazine early and it was a first come, first serve kind of application process, I was one of the lucky people that got in. And that summer, in August of 2005, I took his class, and it was life-changing. It was absolutely life-changing. One of the experiences in the class was something I've now incorporated into my teaching with his permission, was helping people understand their own arcs of their lives and what did they want, and how you had to be intentional with even what you wanted, because if you wanted it badly enough, you could manifest whatever it is you want. I mean, it wasn't talking about curing cancer or going to the moon, things that would really require a fairly big stretch of the imagination and probably a lot more money than anybody had, but just living our lives. What were the choices that we were making in our lives? What were we afraid to admit that we wanted? And why were we so afraid of admitting them? One student who I asked that question to said, well, I'm afraid if I go after what I want and I'm rejected, I'll die of a broken heart. And Milton really taught the whole class, which is now what I try to impart in to my students, is that heartbreak doesn't kill you, regret does. Regret is one of the few human emotions you can't metabolize. Whereas grief, we metabolize. That feeling changes over time, as does love, as does hunger. And so do you want to live a life filled with the one emotion you can't metabolize, which is regret? What would you do if you knew you couldn't fail? And asked us to envision a life 5 years into the future, just experiencing whatever it is we wished we could have. And to write that all down, this day in your life, 5 years from now, having exactly the life you wanted. And because nobody had ever given me that freedom, and because I had started editing the possibilities for my life before I had even decided if they were possible, because I just assumed they were impossible, I put I was like, permission? Imagination? Let's do this. And I wrote a 12-page essay.
Wow.
Not only did I write this essay, I also wrote a list. You know, I was obsessive about this. I'm like, this is a list of things I want in my life 5 years into the future. And it took about 12, 13 years, but I got everything on my list, like every single thing. And they were far-fetched for me. They weren't far-fetched for humanity. Maybe I should have stretched a little bit, I don't know. But teaching, writing a book, I mean, all of the things that I had dreamed about, I suddenly, within 13 years, had. And so I asked Milton, when he stopped teaching, if I could start incorporating this exercise into my teaching. And he said yes, but because so many of my students are so much younger than the mid-career professionals he was teaching, the average age was probably mid-40s at that point in his class, and my students are more in their 20s and 30s, I said, let me give it a 10-year runway. It took a lot longer than me, for me, than 5 years, so let me see if I can push that a bit. And he was like, do what you want. And so that's what I teach, and that's what I talked about with Tim, which I now call your 10-year plan for a remarkable life.
Right, yeah. Do you have a 10-year plan?
Well, in 2017, 12 years later, when I realized, wow, I think this had really happened.
You've manifested the list.
Yeah, I thought, let me do another one. And I procrastinated, and by the end of 2017, it ended up having to be what I did on New Year's Eve, because I was determined to make my deadline, but it had taken me a year of procrastination to do. So the night of December 31st, 2017, I started a new one, continued it well into the morning of 2018, and then in 2018, you know, I fell in love for really, like, the big love.
Yeah.
In 2018. And
you just celebrated your first anniversary, right?
Yes.
Congratulations.
Yes, married
Yeah.
now. So yeah, thank you. So yeah, I really believe in these things.
Did you, you know, you've talked about this, that you didn't come out until you were
50.
And
I'm 60 now, so it's been a while, thankfully. I'm living my truth,
you were living
finally,
that, but was
but,
that something, were you able to imagine that for yourself when you made that original list? Like
No.
what, because, I mean, Paula Scher, who's another incredible designer, in her interview, she talks about navigating, just how hard it is to navigate the world of design, but also to navigate it as a woman. And I'm just wondering what held you back from being who you really were?
I think a lot of my own socialized inner homophobia. I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and it certainly, the world wasn't making it easy for people that were LGBTQ at all.
Yeah.
And I witnessed a lot of that. You know, one of the worst things you can call a little boy when I was growing up was that he was a fag. And so the idea for me, and I suspected that I was gay in my senior year of college, was, well, I'm already so damaged and feel so different from everybody else in the world, and I have to cover that up. Like, being any more different at that time for me felt impossible. It just felt absolutely impossible to do. And so it wasn't until I fell in love with a woman at 50 and she was not willing to live a secret life with me, that I had to come out. And it was terrifying for me. Even so, 10 years ago, 2011, it still felt really scary for me.
Yeah.
And I told people sort of one at a time, very gingerly. When I told my brother, who I really thought was going to freak out because he's somewhat more conservative than I am, thank God, he looked at his wife. I remember it vividly. I had given myself a deadline. It was like 6 months after I had started coming out, wanted to be honest with my family.
Yeah.
Went and saw my brother. His kids were at the time like 3 and maybe 2 and 5. And so super worried that he'd not want me to see the kids. That's how ingrained this was.
Wow.
And I remember after dinner, Jane was doing the dishes. She was wearing plastic gloves. My brother was doing the recycling. And I'm like, guys, I have something to tell you. And they both looked up at me like I was going to tell them I had cancer. Like the look in Jane's face, hands like rubber-gloved hands in the air. My brother's holding like a 2-liter empty bottle of soda. And I said, I'm seeing someone new. And they were like, oh, the relief. And then I said, and they're like, who is he? And I'm like, well, she's a woman. And without missing a beat, my brother looked at his wife. There she is with her rubber gloves on. He's holding a plastic bottle and says, I told you. So that was a good feeling. That was a good feeling.
Yeah.
So, but it was scary. It was super scary.
Yeah.
It's the best thing I ever did. The best thing I ever did. But it was also, at the time, one of the hardest. And I look back now, and I think I look back on every hard decision I've ever made. Leaving a corporate job, turning down a CEO position, things that for months I agonized about, and this was years I agonized and thought and think now, like, why was I so afraid? And I only say that for people that still might be having their own fears about things. I think hard decisions are only hard before you make them.
It also makes me think of the interview with Carmen Maria Machado again, where she's sort of when she's talking about what we've gone through over the last few years, and that this isn't something we've dealt with, right? And that we will continue to deal with, or not. She's pessimistic about that. But it makes you realize that these conditions that we come of age in, or these situations, how much they shape us, how much they limit us, how much they continue to kind of be something we have to weigh rather than just being who we are and being accepted for that. It's very hard. But I wondered, there's so many feminists in this book, and is it true that you worked on Bella Abzug's mayoral candidate? That's our campaign. That's very cool.
Well, no, so Bella Abzug, after her mayoral, I didn't work on her mayoral campaign, but after her mayoral campaign, she and a woman named Mim Kelber decided to put together the first ever compendium of women foreign policy experts.
Okay.
So it was the Women's Foreign Policy Council. They had put this together, and they wanted to put together a compendium of women that could be sent out to the media. So when the media needed commentary about foreign policy, there would be a place where they could see all of the prominent women. This was before the internet. All the prominent women that could be contacted. Condoleezza Rice was in that original consortium of women, and so yeah, I work with Bella on that. It was one of the greatest experiences of my life. But that was in 1985, I think. Yeah, really, quite a long time ago.
Yeah. What influence did that generation of feminists have on you and on your life?
I felt comfortable in a way that I didn't feel with any other group of people I was working with. And that was when I really started, not that Bella was gay or Mim was gay, in fact, they were all straight, but there was such a respect for all women that was when I really wished that I could have come out, but was still too afraid to.
Yeah, yeah. And do you see the podcast as a platform for feminism? Because I'm just thinking
now
about
I do.
all... Yeah.
Now I do, yeah. There was something really pleasing to me about the fact that there were two lesbians back-to-back in the book, which wasn't intentional. And I didn't even realize it until someone else that was interviewing me, and it was for Queer 40, said something about it, and I was like, oh yeah, and it was so great that wasn't something that I noticed, that it wasn't something that the publisher said, maybe you shouldn't have two lesbians back to back. It wasn't. There was no objection to it at all.
Right. It just is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then again, I remember coming out to my cousin's daughter, who lives in California. And lived in Santa Cruz at the time, grew up there, and I remember saying, Maya, I just want to let you know that I'm gay. And she's like, awesome. And I'm like, that's it? She's like, I live in California, everybody's gay. It's like, okay.
We were talking earlier about your father deciding he wasn't going to wear logos, and when you left Sterling Brands, where you worked with all these incredible, big corporate, like Burger King and Tropicana and
Kleenex
7 Up and
yeah.
Everything, that you felt, as you said earlier, like it was just sort of taking a little bit of your soul, and that money wasn't going to be what was going to make you happy.
It wasn't so much that it wasn't going to make me happy, it was that it wasn't going to keep me safe. One of the lead genes in my career was safety, security. Like, no one's ever going to hurt me again. Very Scarlet. I will never go hungry again.
Yeah.
And then when you feel like you've reached what you thought you needed to be safe and still don't feel safe, you realize that that's not what's going to make you feel safe. And so I still grapple with that. So does my brother. No matter what we have, we still always need to have more to feel safe.
Because you grew up in scarcity.
Yeah.
Mode.
And so that was sort of that was the lead gene for me. And how much do you really need in your life to feel safe? Well, it's not about that. Once you reach a certain level of self-sufficiency, it doesn't make you more self-sufficient. If you're using it to feel self-sufficient, you're never going to feel self-sufficient.
So the moving in the direction that you have, leaving the corporate world, not taking the position of a CEO, do you feel like you've kind of synthesized the world of branding with the projects you do that are clearly a passion for you, that drive you, that maybe do make you feel self-sufficient? Has that kind of I don't know, come together in a different way. Because you're making a podcast in a moment where podcasts are just exploding. You know, there is all kinds of corporate interests have podcasts now.
No, it's true. When I started doing this podcast, people didn't know what a podcast was.
Yeah.
And I only made it into a podcast to be able, there was no podcast section on, it was then called iTunes, now it's Apple. But there wasn't a podcast section. I was uploading it to iTunes so that my friends could listen to the show at any time they wanted, because the only time the radio show was broadcast was live and then rebroadcast in the wee hours of the morning.
Yeah.
So, you know, one of my techie friends was like, upload it to iTunes. This way anybody can listen to it at any time they want, like an indie musician. And as long as you had a server that you could hold your own content on, you could do that. And that's what I did. So at the beginning it was like, what's a podcast? And now it's like, oh, I do a podcast. And we're like, oh, yeah, like you too? Good for you.
Wow.
Right. But I still do branding work, but I will only do branding work for organizations that I feel really need it and are doing good with it. So, you know, I do a lot of work with the Joyful Heart Foundation, which is Mariska Hargitay's foundation. She's the star of Law & Order SVU. My original work with that was in the No More movement, which my friend Christine Mao is one of the board members of. If it weren't for her, I wouldn't have been doing this work at all. That came through work that I was doing for Kleenex and for Kimberly-Clark. And so Christine, as the global design director at the time, was looking to partner with one of her agencies pro bono to do this work. And I was like, yes, please. You know, she didn't know my history. She just thought that then of course, you know, I did disclose to her. And so she was really the person that pulled me into that work. And through her, I met Mariska Hargitay, who's the star of Law & Order SVU, who started this foundation after she started starring on the show, and thousands of people were writing to her, disclosing to her, and she needed a place to be able to help them. And so I do the work, all of the work for them, and also Lambda Legal, which is one of the organizations that really helped marriage equality become a reality. So that really, you know, I said this to Tim, and I'll say it again, you know, that work really does make it feel like my life makes sense.
Yeah.
Like, oh, okay, now 60 years in, I can say, okay, there's something kind of wonderfully symmetrical about this.
Where do you go from here? So what's the next, I mean, you just put this book out. Now you've done books on interviews before, but what happens next for Why Design Matters?
Well, you know, I get so much joy doing the podcast that I kind of would like to think that I'll do this for the rest of my life. It's a gift. It's a real gift. And so I would like to keep doing it. I love teaching. I love watching my students evolve. There's always a moment with students where you're like, oh, they get it. This is it. That's happening right now. And that witnessing, you know, that's incredible to me. So I'd like to keep doing that. And now that I'm a married woman, you know, I'd like to spend as much time with my wife as possible.
You're going to Antarctica.
We're going to Antarctica. So when I left my corporate job, I had always traveled for business. So the idea of ever going on a vacation to travel somewhere was just like, I can't do another airport. When I stopped doing that, I suddenly realized I wanted to try to see the world before I died. And so in 2017, when there was a total solar eclipse of the sun in North America, and I only saw a partial in New York, I thought, I want to go see a total solar eclipse of the sun somewhere. And I went to like totalsolareclipseofthesun.com, which exists, and there I saw in 2021, 5 years later, there's going to be a total solar eclipse of the sun on Antarctica. It's like, sign me up. And now it's like 3 weeks away.
Very cool. Well, I hope you have a wonderful trip.
Thank you.
Thank you for making the trip back to Chicago.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Alison. Thank you for doing an interview, such a hard thing, and this was an honor and a privilege to sit with you and talk with you.
It was my honor and privilege.
Thank you.
So thank you so much. So
Thank you.
The book will be coming out
February,
so
Pre-orders
get your
are
pre-order in
available.
now. It's an incredible, it really is. It's a beautiful coffee table, but it's also a deep dive into some really fascinating people and experiences, and it was such a pleasure to read it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks
Thank you
everyone
all.
for being here.